Welcome back to Tying Tuesday. I'm Copland here at AvidMax, and today I'm tying up my personal hopper. I call it the Copland's hopper. And it's one of my personal patterns. This is a great pattern for trout. I like to fish it pretty much throughout all summer into early fall. Before we get started, I would love if you would smash that subscribe button and drop us a like on this video. It helps out our channel a ton. So this is our hopper. You can see it's very small. This is on the size 12. I'll be tying it in the size 10 today. The hook I'll be using is just a standard size 12. Pretty much any hook will work, but this is a D100 from Spirit River. It's a great company. And then you can see on here that it's a foam pattern. We've got a McFly long wing, and we've got some hackle that's trimmed on the bottom here just so that it will sit really flat. And with these legs, if you can actually angle them a bit down when you're tying, that is the best way to do this, just because then it'll, the legs will kind of flutter in the water. It works out really well. All right. So we'll be starting off with just a UTC 140 denier in tan. It doesn't really matter what thread size you use. Usually I like to go 140 just because it's a lot easier to tie down your foam without it breaking. And I like to go tan just because I will be using a tan foam today. But you can really tie this in any color you like. I like tan and brown, those are my personal favorites, but it really doesn't matter. You can practice with whatever foam you like, but tan and brown usually work the best. To start off, I tie backwards. I am left-handed. You can tie whichever way you like, it doesn't really matter. But since I'm left-handed, I tie a little weird. So I'm just going to go ahead and start this right behind the eye. Let's wind that up a bit. And it doesn't need to be a very even thread base. And then once I have that, I'm going to go ahead and you can either break or snip your excess. Tag free, I like to cut it out just because, it is a stronger thread. I don't want to mess up my thread wraps. So I'm going to wrap that back. And then for the tail, I actually use some Ringneck Pheasant. I know, not a very common material for your hoppers, but it works really well for this. So I'm just going to take probably 5 or 6 fibers, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. It really doesn't matter. Just do a nice small clump, pull them perpendicular to the stem, hold those just so the tips line up pretty well, and then I'm just going to cut those out. You can pull them off if you like. I like to cut them just so it's nice and even. Alright. And you're going to measure about a shank length long, and then I'm going to transfer that measurement here, do a pinch wrap, and tie it right down there. And then that'll stick out. I like a nice long tail, just because then it sticks out beyond the foam. I'm going to wrap this forward, really anchoring those down. I'm going to wrap almost all the way to the eye, just so it builds up a little bit of body. It's totally fine if your fibers wrap around the hook like mine did. They did fully around, but it just matters that it's anchored down. Cut those right out. Now I'm going to bring my thread all the way back to the bend of the hook. And it's fine if some butt ends are showing of those fibers. Bring that right there. And now I get to tie in my foam. So with this foam, I'm going to cut it so it's notched. I'll show you what I mean in just a second. Almost like an Amy's ant on the tail there. Something just like that. I mean, your foam doesn't have to be perfect. The fish will bite it either way. Then I'm going to go and put this very bottom point right there on the very tip of that triangle. I'm going to try to find just the midpoint of those fibers. And then I'm going to anchor that down with a few tight turns. Alright, and this doesn't have to be perfect. Again, it's totally fine. The fish will bite it either way. But what you want to do is you don't want to bind down past that point, past where you tied in your fibers, because then that'll cause your fibers to bend downward and it will just kind of drape into the water, and you don't want that. But now I'm going to actually bind this foam down all the way, grab my scissors here, all the way to those butt ends. So what I do for this is I take a few loose wraps and just tighten that down, tighten it down, tighten it down, just like that, and then you can go back over it and smooth it out. But that's just so I can get it really anchored in place. Alright, and then before I finish this off, I always want to make sure that these are lying completely flat along the hook. And then I'm going to cut and leave maybe, I don't know, an inch, maybe about of foam there, just so it's not in my way, and then I can tie a lot easier. Go ahead and wrap that, and then you want to make a really smooth body here. Because then you will be applying some Zap-A-Gap just to really soak into those thread wraps. You can also use super glue if you want. Zap-A-Gap, just fancy super glue. Pretty much all it is. what that does, it really holds that foam in place and makes sure it doesn't spin around the body of your fly, or well, spin around the hook, and then the body of your fly will not look so great. So just something like that. You can see I still have a bit of foam showing, but that'll work just fine. I'm going to take my Zap-A-Gap, and this you really don't need much, maybe 1 drop at the most. You can see I just put some right on there, and then I can smear that around. And this does dry very quickly, and it doesn't have to cover your whole thread base here. So mine just came right up to about my thread, just got back here. That'll hold just fine. And with Zap-A-Gap, less is always more. Wrap backward to the very base of that foam, and leave your thread right there. You can see these fibers are starting to go down a little bit, so I'm just going to pull those up just like that. Really just fold them up and have them stick out straight. Like I said, it really doesn't matter, but as long as you're not, binding right down on them, it'll be fine. Now I'm going to take about 3 strands of Peacock Herl. This can be pretty much any type of Peacock Herl you want, extra long, thin, whatever you want. And I'm going to be grabbing the butt ends and have them pointed toward the eye of the hook, and I'm going to tie in by the tips. However, the tips are usually very, very thin and brittle, so I'm going to cut maybe about an inch, inch and a half off, right about there. And what that'll do is it'll allow me to have a much more sturdy tie-in and not risk these breaking. So I'm going to tie these in right about here. Put this back a bit. All right. And then with this, the best part about this fly is that you really can anchor these in really well because you'll be wrapping the Peacock Herl all around this. Just like that. All right. Now I'm going to take just 1 strand of silly legs, break these off. What I'm using is a green pumpkin with a little bit of orange sparkle in it. You can really use any silly leg. It's a barred silly leg, so that means it has little stripes on it. It works really well. It's one of my favorites. And then I'm going to tie this on the near side first. I'm going to tie just about a little over a shank length. Maybe you measure to the end of the tail there. And I'm going to put that right at the base of the foam here. Do a few tight turns. And then the reason you don't want to wrap all the way right away is just so that way you can actually adjust it. So this leg was sticking up a bit. I want these, like I said before, to be angled down just very slightly, something like this. Now I can tighten that down. All right, then I'm going to fold this back, wrap all the way to the eye, and then I can stretch it back forward and take a wrap over that. That's just so you can tie it in much easier. Take a wrap in front, take a wrap behind. And then that'll make it stick straight down, and we'll make it stick out a bit later, so it's not, all just sticking right down. Take a few wraps to about the midpoint there. Fold this back, so then you've got a loop here on your front end, right there. And then you want to make the legs about the same length. We will be trimming these at the very end. So if you don't make it exactly the same length, it's totally fine. All right, and these guys are sticking out completely straight right now, perpendicular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull these down and back like that, and then do 1 more turn over the top, and that should make them straight but a little bit back. And the hackle and the Peacock Herl, that will make it stick the correct way. That'll make it fold out backwards. Now I'm going to wrap forward or over that loop and completely bind these down. All right, and then you can see that loop was getting in my way a bit. So now I'm going to take my scissors, find the midpoint just by stretching it out like this. Let's see if I can get it down here. Just find about the midpoint and go ahead and cut that right there, and then the legs will stick out straight. All right. Now you get to tie in your hackle. So I'm just using yellow barred hackle. It really doesn't matter. Just this one is one of my favorites. This is just from Whiting Farms. Usually this is the saddle hackle, works best for this. So I stripped off some of the very end fibers there just to make this an easier tie-in point. If you tie in without stripping those fibers off, what that'll do is it'll make the hackle, it might cause it to slide right out of your wraps. So I'm going to take a turn over that. Now I can wrap this all the way forward, just over my hackle. It doesn't need to be fully covered because, again, we are covering this because we will be wrapping all of those materials forward at some point. All right, and then once I'm at the front, I'm going to take a few turn whip finish just so I can use my rotary function on my vise. With this, you can also use half hitches, whatever you prefer. Now, since I do tie backwards, I come around the far side of the hook. If you tie normal, then you can, and then just do your standard whip finish. So I'm gonna do about 2 turns there, and just be careful of your legs that you don't get those caught in your whip finish. All right, just like that. All right, and the reason we do this is that when we use our bobbin cradle, what the thread will do is it won't keep wrapping around your hook or unwrapping. So now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take all of these fibers and pull them straight up, and you can wrap them around your hook like that, or if your vise does have a rotary function, just hold the ends and go ahead and spin your vise to use that rotary function to wrap those around your fly and create a nice body there. Now you're gonna take your thread here, just gonna get that bobbin cradle out of the way, and you're gonna take a wrap and really secure these Peacock Herls in place. Now the thing with Peacock Herl, it does have a very flat stem. So if you try to break these off, what will probably happen is they will slip under your wraps and explode. And that's not what you want, especially when you cut them to perfect length, then you can't really use them again. So then, you can't cover your whole body very well. So I always cut these out, just like that. And since we wrapped since the whip finish, we need to throw another whip finish on there, just so that when we turn our vise with our rotary, the peacock doesn't come undone, because then our thread will unwrap and that will not be good. If you're just wrapping without a rotary, you do not need to do this step. All right. And it's totally fine if some of your thread is showing. So if I turn my fly here, you can see that there is some thread showing right there. This is one of the reasons I use tan, just because it blends in with the foam pretty well. But we will be covering this by folding our foam back like that, so it really won't matter. So now we go ahead and wrap our hackle around, and you do not want this, you want to try to fit as much hackle in there as you can without, really packing it in there. So I want to do a few good wraps, probably 5 or 6 good wraps with my hackle, and then tie that off right there. All right, with just 4 or 5 turns. And then you can adjust your legs, pull that up, and hackle, it does not have a very flat stem, but still, if you try to break it, because you are not wrapping, because your wraps are very stacked on top of each other, a lot of times your hackle will also slip under the wraps. So make sure you cut your materials, rather than just breaking them. All right, so if I turn my fly here, you can see I do have some hackle fibers, pull that down for you, that slipped in front of my wrap. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna trim those right out. Just be careful not to cut your thread or your silly legs. All right. Now we can go ahead and tie in our McFly-lon. You can also use polypro yarn, just this stuff here. I like to tie it in white. This is for our wing. So you just need maybe an inch, a little more. And for a size 10, which is what this is, you really don't need to separate these fibers, just because we will be doubling them over. So it'll be about double the thickness for your wing here, and then you can really flare it out. So we want to find the approximate midpoint for this. You can see I have a little longer than a shank, but we want to find the approximate midpoint and bump it forward just slightly so the part toward the eye is just a tad longer. Go ahead and take one wrap over that, really trying not to catch your hackle. You can tighten that down, take a few more. And you can see how this section is a bit longer than this section. Now, the reason we did that is so that we can double it back and kind of fold it like that so that there is a little loop there. Turn my vise here. See, there's a little loop there? That will really help you to tie it down well so that you can really bind down on both of those and have them both sticking back. And this will be covered when we fold that back. And then you can just kind of flare that out a bit, really mess it up. Yeah, just really try to get those fibers separated. And then any stragglers that are really out there, you can just clip those right off. Because you want the wing to be approximately the same length, but you do not want to just go in and trim all of that off right there. The reason for that is because that won't look very natural. We want our wing to be a little uneven, but for the most part pretty even. But fibers like this that are just sticking right out there, we really don't want that, so we're just going to cut that out. Same thing with anything that came in front. All right, now what we can do is we can fold this over, and if you want to measure it so that the back here is just aligned with the very start of this tail foam here. You don't want to go too short like this, and you don't want to go way too long like that. You want to try to line those up pretty well. Just, see if I can move my finger here. Something about that. So once you have that measurement, what you're going to do is you're going to fold that over right there. And if you have a ton of foam and it leaves a head, something like that, where it's way too much, just fold it back. We'll be cutting it. And then just want to fold it back pretty tight. But what we will be doing, if it's too long, you will be cutting it to length. So we're going to push down here, fold that right back. And then you can hold it against the body with your finger, just your index finger there. Brush some of those fibers out of the way. And take a few tight turns, really binding that down. And this is a part where you really have to be careful not to break your thread. So if you pull way too tight, you will break it, and then just because this is the very large clump of material that we're tying down, because we're binding this foam across all of that hackle, peacock herl, everything like that. So I'm going to go ahead and take my scissors and cut and trim this to length. So I'll show you what that looks like. So again, we want to measure right about there and just try to cut it off flat. See how my foam on top comes right down, aligns with the foam on the bottom. That's what we want to do there. Alright, now we take one more strand of peacock herl. And this time, I should tie a few more loops around there to really bind that down. This time what we're going to do, we're going to tie in by the butt section. And the reason for this is because the butt section is going to be much thicker than the tip section, as you can see there. Let's see if I can get it on camera. Yeah, see how that section is much thicker than this section? The only thing is we do not want any of this white stem exposed. So that's why we're going to tie in about there where there still is a good amount of good fiber there, but that's just playing it safe. So what we're going to do, we're going to tie in this with a few relatively tight turns. If you tie it too tight, your thread might snap the herl if you tie it way too tight. And then tie that down just like that. Then you're going to go ahead and trim off that very end section there. So then you just have the tip section. Now, I am not going to use my rotary function for this just because there are so few wraps that we need to do. Just those legs. But now what we're going to do, we're going to wrap our peacock herl around that collar right where we tied down the head of our fly. Wrap that down a few times. Oh, got my leg there. It happens to everyone. Just like that. Just 3 or 4 turns will be plenty. That's just to give it a nice green collar. And I can take my thread here and just do 1, maybe 2 turns to bind that down. What we don't want to have happen is that we're wrapping our thread on top of our herl, and then that kind of defeats the purpose of tying in herl. Now what I can do is come right down here, trim that herl out nice and close, and then I'm going to take one more very tight, well not very tight, but pretty tight wrap over top just to really bind that down. Then at this point, what we want to do is make sure our foam is lying flat. So make sure it's not, something like that. We don't want that. We want to twist that just so that it really lines up. See if I can show you there. Yeah, just like that. And then now we're going to start whip finishing. So what we don't want to do is you not want to whip finish right on that peacock herl because again, we will be binding that down and then that peacock herl won't show. So what we're going to do, we're going to turn our fly over. And this is kind of a tough part, but what you're going to do is you're going to transfer your thread around the eye and take a few wraps. So now our thread is coming right off the hook here. Pull that back. See how our thread is coming on right off the hook and rather not sitting on top of the foam. Now again, what we can do is we can take a few more wraps, really make a thread base there. And one of the tips I found that really helps you get a good whip finish is to take hackle pliers and grab the very ends of those silly legs, and then you can just drape them back. I like to hook them onto my vise, but that's total personal preference. So what I'll do is I will pull these back, so then they're just out of my way. Now I can probably do a 4 or 5 turn whip finish. And then that's just right again on the eye of your hook, right behind it. I actually did 6 wraps there, and you can do a second one if you want to. It doesn't really matter. One, decent whip finish will be enough. I'll just do a second one just to be safe. And again, that is right on the hook behind the eye. That one was only 3 or 4 reps. Pull that right back. And then wind my thread up a bit, and then I'm going to cut that thread right out. Just like that. And now this is a good time when you trim out any of these little fibers, these little hackle fibers that got stuck in front of the main clump. Without your silly legs in the way, it makes it a lot easier, because then you can cut them out pretty quickly and you don't need to worry about cutting your legs. Now I'm going to go ahead and release these from the hackle pliers, just like that. Now there comes the adjustment for the legs. So you can see how my back legs are already sticking out pretty well backwards, and you can kind of tug them down so then they stick out downward. Same with our front. See how the weight is pulling them down a lot. But now we can turn our fly to the side, and we want our legs to be about the length of the shank of the hook. So if you're tying a much bigger fly, maybe a size 8 or something like that, your legs will be longer than a size 14. So I'll cut this right about there. And remember, you can always take off more, but you can't really put it back on. Then cut them pretty much the same length. So I like to put my scissors, I like to push them flat, just like this, flush right up against there, and trim them both. You can see those are pretty even now. And then you can take a look up top. Yep, looks good. And then you can go to the other side. All right. Now, final adjustment, pull them outwards like this, make sure not to snap them, and then squeeze them down. And that's it. That is my hopper. I call it the Copland's hopper. It's just because I'm Copland, but yeah, it really doesn't have a set name, but it's just one of my favorites. Thank you for tuning in to Tying Tuesday. You can get all these materials in our shop here in Centennial, or visit us online at AvidMax.com. Also, please head over to Trout Trickers and check out their epic float and wade trips. Their website you can find that online. And please don't forget to smash that subscribe button and drop us a like. Thank you again.